Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Wednesday, June 18th, 2025, and today we are going to be talking about last night's primary elections in the state of Virginia, a battleground state that is in full force and full swing as the primary season ends today with an announcement 20 minutes ago, actually, that the now Democratic nominee for Lieutenant Governor, Ghazala Hashmi, has won the Lieutenant Governor's primary, a very, very competitive race that ultimately was absorbing a lot of the oxygen and conversation around what Virginia might look like this coming November election. Now, if you have been interested in Virginia for quite some time, you might know that on the governor level, there was not a competitive primary. Unlike 2021 and arguably unlike 2017, the governor primaries went largely uncontested. The incumbent lieutenant governor, Winsome Sears, on the Republican side, was pretty much uniformly elected by the Virginia delegation to be the nominee. They cleared the race for her. She originally had faced some opposition from some members of the Virginia GOP. Eventually, they said that it wouldn't make sense, but that came after Abigail Spanberger, a U.S. representative from Virginia, also cleared her field on the Democratic side, to which both parties essentially, not necessarily together, but separately agreed that it would be best for unification and electoral strategy if they could focus on the general election early on. But the lieutenant governor's race and the attorney general's race faced no similarities. The lieutenant governor's race was a very crowded primary, one of the closest we have seen in Virginia history, and region upon region resulted in the eventual nominee being Ghazala Hashmi. On the Attorney General side, Jay Jones, who ran for Attorney General against an incumbent 4 years ago, decided to run again against Shannon Taylor. Both of these two candidates would likely have faced a formidable opponent in the general election. We are expecting that on the Republican side, this is the best performing race for the GOP, but ultimately, Jay Jones came ahead by a margin of roughly 10,000 votes. Now, the interesting thing about the Virginia race thus far is, like I said, what we saw shake out yesterday was going to be what determined, largely speaking, how Democrats performed in the eventual 2025 elections this coming November. Obviously, with the gubernatorial race taking a lot of the focus, people didn't really think much about the lieutenant governor's race or the attorney general's race, but for voters on the Democratic side in Virginia, this was arguably a very important race. Looking at the lieutenant governor's race, like I said, broken down by region, you really saw that the strength of the candidates did come from areas and regions across the state that these candidates knew best, that they in some cases had represented, had served alongside, local municipality elections, whatever it might be. And that translated to either a strong amount of support in the primary election or lack of support due to their time in local governance. And I say that to point out that this race, again, being decided by just 3,000 votes statewide really is tremendous about how close and competitive it actually was. Going into this race based on what the data had foretold, Ghazala Hashmi was never going to be in a good position to win this race, at least based on initial indication. What we saw in those early stages was that she was polling at 8%, 10%, that more recognizable names across regions of the state, like LeVar Stoney or Aaron Rouse, were polling better. Categorically, in every single data point we had, Ghazala Hashmi was coming up in third, if not fourth place. But win the primary, she did. On the Attorney General's race, it was always going to be more competitive. The expectation was that it was going to be this battle between, Jay Jones and Shannon Taylor, both of which came from, arguably different regions of the state. But at the same time, the race was never going to be one that was going to be a slam dunk in either direction. Jay Jones had the name ID coming off of where he was back 4 years ago. If you know a little bit about the race in 2021, was that there was a huge scandal that unfolded surrounding incumbent Governor Ralph Northam, who was term limited, but issues surrounding a blackface scandal that similarly happened for the Attorney General. And so Democrats had looked to actually primary their own incumbent in 2021, who did go on to lose the eventual general election. Point is, though, that race was more competitive. Jay Jones had run before, and so this time around, he decided to run again. And so it was always going to be this battle. I will say the Attorney General's race is the one that I think will actually be the most competitive. Jason Miyares is the Republican incumbent who did, well in 2021, and I say well because he was facing a two-time incumbent who had outperformed Democrats before, and so to see it this time, last time, Democrats actually lose that race when they were largely on track for expectations from top political pundits, from Virginia strategists to actually hold on to that race, even if they were going to lose the governorship, for Jason Miyares to win it showed that there was some type of electoral strength that just simply was not recognized and simply just not tapped into to the same way or understood the same way that this time Democrats do not seem that they are going to be taking for granted. So the attorney general's race is going to be competitive. The lieutenant governor's race probably won't be competitive too. And I also say that this one probably was going to be the race that played kingmaker the most. When you think about what's happening in the lieutenant governor's race thus far, there was actually a huge scandal on the Republican side. And it mostly is, for most parts, a Republican scandal. Probably won't impact the general election as much, but enough so that Governor Glenn Youngkin actually called the Republican nominee for lieutenant governor, John Reed, and asked him to drop out of the race so a better Republican, a more electable Republican could run. He has a pretty shaky history in the past, one that probably would lend itself to someone being less electable. Though I will say there is a slight chance that the governor's race is slightly more advantageous for Democrats just because that's where all the funding is going, all the attention, and it reminds me a lot of this, not to compare apples and oranges, but a Mark Robinson situation in 2020 where, yes, a lot of things did come out about the lieutenant governor candidate, but nobody is paying attention to the lieutenant governor's race. And so sometimes people slip under the radar and win. Then when they get to a more high-profile position and run, they end up losing. Same thing happening here with Winsome Sears, who skated by in 2021, largely on the back of Glenn Youngkin. Probably won't be winning in 2025. So John Reed could be a similar situation, but Democrats now have their candidate. Democrats now have someone who, state senator, and also, too, largely speaking, was not the expected candidate on the Democratic side. You can take a look at what the data said. Like I said, at some points in time, she was polling in third, in some cases, a distant third. LeVar Stoney and Aaron Rouse very clearly were meant to be those frontrunners. Inevitably, that's not what happened. And what is interesting, too, is when it comes down to this endorsement race here, you found that the connections that Ghazala Hashmi had in the state legislature, in the House of Delegates, and the state Senate, did end up benefiting her in this election. You saw that she was endorsed, sure, by a number of candidates, but Aaron Rouse also, had an endorsement of Elaine Luria in the region that also, when you look at the primary results, where did he do best? In the area that he was expected to do best, in the Virginia Beach and Norfolk area. Again, those are the benefits of him receiving those endorsements. Simultaneously, LeVar Stoney received a high-profile endorsement. There was a co-endorsement with Terry McAuliffe. I remember the ads being cut there. I'm in, the D.C. metro area. You can see sometimes these things get into the metropolitan ad buy area to Northern Virginia. Yes, the McAuliffe endorsement was touted very heavily. They did a TV ad together. Pete Buttigieg endorsing LeVar Stoney. So it's interesting on that front that when push came to shove, that Terry McAuliffe's endorsement and Pete Buttigieg's endorsement didn't end up panning out as powerfully as endorsements from state representatives, from state delegates, rather. That's how Virginia calls them, not representatives. Important distinction there. State senators, but nobody really that was presently representing Virginia in the House of Representatives was endorsing in this race, at least not the Democratic nominee. There wasn't as many people on a local level endorsing Ghazala Hashmi in this race. So largely speaking, it makes sense that this was taken as a shock for many Democrats, but I think this will be the lieutenant governor. Barring what happens on the governor level, on the attorney general's race, this race probably won't be too competitive on the Republican side or on the Democratic side, and chances are most of these races won't be either. Chances are Democrats will win the House of Delegates in 2025, win the state Senate in 2025, win the governorship in 2025, win the attorney general's race in 2025. Virginia is panning out to be a pretty strong race for the Democratic Party, and that is largely with, one, the uncontested primary on the governor level. We largely know that Abigail Spanberger is still the favorite today, but now with these lieutenant governor picks and attorney general picks, chances are Democrats are going to hold on. And so I think back to the 2021 Virginia primary results. I mentioned that they did have a primary. In theory, it wasn't as competitive as it should have been for Democrats, eventually knowing the election result there. But Terry McAuliffe raced against a number of candidates, many of which decided not to run this time around. Terry McAuliffe got 62% of the vote. Lieutenant governor's race was a bit more competitive, wasn't a clear indicator as to who was going to actually win this race. Obviously, all of these candidates ended up losing. The reason I pointed out, though, is, again, like I said, Jay Jones ran for attorney general 4 years ago, lost that primary to Mark Herring this time around, coming back and winning the Democratic primary. So, again, that name ID thing, I think, was a component, especially on the margins, seeing how close it was. 10,000 votes A previous election can make all the difference. In 2017, though, and a more interesting race, I will say, not as much on the competitive side, on the Democratic Republican side. Obviously, still a 10-point victory. Ralph Northam, though, we largely knew was going to win. We covered this race very early on when I was creating videos. I think it was 7 days out I started this channel 7 days before this primary election actually took place. The interesting thing, though, was Ed Gillespie was someone who was perceived as a bit more of this more moderate, more traditional Republican. I will say the type of Republican that was able to do better in Virginia than Donald Trump had, and that this new wave of Republican candidates had or would be able to do in the future. Corey Stewart was on the oppositional end, sort of this battle between Stewart, who was more MAGA, Ed Gillespie, who was more traditional. Ed Gillespie ended up coming through. Corey Stewart ended up running for office later, won Republican nominations, and lost by even larger margins. But that's besides the point. Ed Gillespie actually had a pretty competitive race on the governor level. Lieutenant governor's race was also competitive on the Republican side, about 2.7%. Obviously, these two Republicans ended up losing the election, so really doesn't matter by the end of it. But you have to think the type of candidate, the type of person you're nominating, where you're nominating them, how they're doing, does largely translate to performance in the eventual election. And so I do think right now what the expectation is for the Democrats is they win the lieutenant governor's race, but the attorney general's race will be more competitive. But if, and this is an if Spanberger is winning on the top of the ticket, I keep saying national. I apologize. I'm stuck in this presidential election analysis around Virginia. We haven't covered a governor's race here in 4 years. Should the governor's race go in favor of Spanberger by 10 points, Democrats are not losing anything statewide. There is not enough crossover support here in the attorney general's race that would even warrant Jay Jones losing in a race where Spanberger's winning. Now, if Spanberger ends up collapsing in a similar way that we saw with the McAuliffe campaign in 2021, going from starting out in that primary with a 7-point advantage to losing by 2 points, that's a 9-point swing. Should she win by 1 or 2 points, that is a collapse relative to where she is today, then yes, the attorney general's race might look different. And maybe the lieutenant governor's race might look different. But the likelihood of that happening in the present age, with Donald Trump's approval rating on the decline, with voters in Virginia being some of the most enraged and engaged by far, given their proximity to federal politics, given their proximity to the federal workforce, a lot of federal workers, or maybe not anymore, following DOGE cuts in Northern Virginia, that are voters that might have been previously slightly on board with Trump a little bit more than they were in 2020, but not that they voted for him, right? They overwhelmingly voted for Harris, but more than before. There is an argument to be made that this time around, we're not going to see that reversal, that it won't take a debate slip up, a moment talking about critical race theory and things that made the race and defined the race 4 years ago that would not define it today and would not impact it today because of that looming threat, I would say, of Donald Trump's presidency on the Commonwealth of Virginia. And so looking at 2025, I largely have come to understand that while there's a lot of theatrics and a lot of, political conversation around the hyper competitiveness of Virginia, because it did get closer in the last presidential election. After all, despite it getting closer, Kamala Harris still won the state by 5.91%. Kamala Harris and Tim Walz still won Virginia by a larger margin than Clinton did in 2016, with her vice presidential nominee being the senator of Virginia. And so while 2021 certainly was an overperformance for Republicans and a massive swing in the right direction, pun intended, for the GOP, we will not see that happen again in 2025, at least not based on where we are today. Flukes happen and outsized overperformances happen all the time. Democrats can tell you that. They know that special elections and midterm elections and overperformances in states that they might have lost before don't necessarily mean you're not going to lose it again, right? This is the way that I think Democrats have fallen into this consistent trap, and not just Democrats, right? Political pundits, whoever it might be. Because the expectation is that, when elections like this happen, it means something permanently. But it doesn't mean something permanently that Glenn Youngkin, with the perfect set of circumstances, the perfect storm being built for a Republican victory, that a Republican victory happened. And not to take it away from Glenn Youngkin, right? Impressive victory, impressive showing for the GOP. They did what many people thought 4 years prior was that the Virginia GOP was done. They very quickly revived it. But in 2025, we are not in a similar set of circumstances. We are not in this moment this environment is not conducive to a Republican victory. Now, the last thing I'd point out about the lieutenant governor's race is that I think it is quite interesting. When you take a look at the regions that, the Democrats ended up performing the best in, obviously a lot of it is very regional. But when you think about LeVar Stoney, who also, might I add, was running for governor originally, decided that he wanted to run for lieutenant governor, dropped down, he's in second place. But he lost by about 3,000 votes. Now, he was mayor of Richmond, Virginia. And his performance in the Richmond area was largely seen actually as something that was a negative on his campaign. And when you take a look at the more narrowed in races in Richmond's area, you can find that on the margins here, let's see if we can go ahead and just pull it up, LeVar Stoney wasn't doing well enough in this area that he was able to hold on meaningfully to enough support to win him the nomination outright, to win him this nomination statewide. Because when you take a look, I know I'm passing through a bunch of counties here. What I'm trying to do here is actually count them up. But when you take the votes here, good example, Richmond County, but also in the surrounding areas too, you'll find that when you add these votes up, you've come up with about a 15,000 vote delta. A 15,000 vote delta where Ghazala Hashmi, not the former mayor of the city, is winning over the former mayor. 15,000 votes. Remember that. Look back at the total votes, a 3,000 vote delta. So about 15,000 votes in 11,000 in Richmond, but 15,000 in the total area. 15,000 votes. Where in a region where what we have seen in Virginia is that regional politics largely does define these primaries. How you perform, where you perform, how well you are entrenched, right? All of these things really did collapse him. And so LeVar Stoney, in these initial conversations around his performance as mayor, there were many Democrats who were saying, I don't want him to be the nominee because if he is the nominee, this area, this pocket of Democratic votes that we might have traditionally relied on for victory in the November election might not have came through. In the primary, though, they certainly displayed their disaffection with the former mayor. Because as much as he should have on paper done well in this area, it largely might have been the reason for his loss. Because that is the area in which he consistently underperformed. Across the state, arguably, had Richmond and the surrounding area voted the way that many of the surrounding counties voted in favor of LeVar Stoney, he would have won this nomination. 15,000 lost votes in your hometown when you lose statewide by 3,000, a lot of questions to be asked there. And so that is something that I think really does explain why Ghazala Hashmi is able to win this state, why she was able to do well in the lieutenant governor's race, and arguably why many Democrats think she would do better in the general election. So just something to think about, just something to look at, because we very rarely see that a hometown advantage turns into a disadvantage. And in this lieutenant governor's primary, it very much seemed like that was the case. So looking at the lieutenant governor's race, looking at the attorney general's race, largely good news for the Democratic Party. Will be interesting to see how it pans out in the November general election. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video for you to watch, and then a playlist for my 2025 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.